The gates of the grand arena groaned as they slowly slid open, revealing the brutal battlefield beyond. The sand, once golden, had long since turned a deep shade of rust from years of spilled blood. Towering metal walls lined the perimeter, their jagged spikes gleaming under the harsh artificial lights of the domed Colosseum. Above them, the stands trembled under the weight of thousands of spectators, their monstrous forms pressed together in a chaotic, writhing mass. Roars, screeches, and guttural growls echoed through the chamber, the collective voice of the galaxy's most bloodthirsty crowd. Today, the audience had come to witness the arrival of a new challenger, one unlike any the arena had seen before. A figure stepped into the sand. He was unarmored, unarmed, and by all accounts unimpressive. His body, though lean and muscular, lacked the sheer bulk and mass of the titanic warriors surrounding him. His pale skin bore no natural armor, no hardened scales, no cybernetic enhancements. He had no mandibles, no claws, no venomous appendages. He was, by their standards, utterly ordinary. A human. Silence swept through the arena for a brief moment before the laughter began. It started as a few snorts, then grew into a roaring cacophony of jeers and taunts. Warriors of every species, the reptilian jarl, the insectoid Kryn, the massive four-armed grots, thumped their weapons against their chests, their exoskeletons, their armored plates, mocking the sight before them. Even the seasoned gladiators who had faced countless horrors on the sands could not contain their amusement. A human? What a joke. Charles Voss stood motionless, his expression unreadable. He had seen worse, much worse. A booming voice erupted from the floating platform above, where the arena masters presided over the carnage. "Warriors of the grand arena, feast your eyes upon your newest competitor. From the primitive world of Earth, the so-called Death Worlder, this weak creature claims to be a fighter. Let us see if he can survive even a single round." The crowd howled, their bloodlust intensifying. Across from him, the first challenger stepped forward, a monstrous brute nearly 3 meters tall, his thick, scaled hide glistening with sweat and anticipation. He belonged to the Zorath species, infamous for their brute strength and relentless aggression. His name, Voss had already learned, was Garrick, a veteran of the arena, undefeated for the last 7 cycles. His 4 muscular arms gripped a serrated axe and a curved dagger, each weapon designed to tear through flesh with ease. The fight was meant to be over quickly, a show of dominance. Garrick sneered, baring his jagged teeth. "I will make this quick, little human. Your bones will decorate my trophy wall." Voss didn't respond. He simply rolled his shoulders, stretching his neck from side to side. His breath was steady, his posture relaxed. It was not the stance of a frightened man, nor of a desperate one. It was something else, something calculated. The horn sounded. Garrick lunged, moving with a speed that belied his massive frame. His axe swung downward, a strike meant to split a man in 2. The air whistled as the blade cut through it, but at the last second, Voss shifted, just enough. The axe missed him by mere inches, embedding itself in the sand. Before Garrick could recover, Voss stepped forward. His hands moved in a blur. One struck the Zorath's wrist, twisting the dagger from his grip. The other slammed into the side of his knee, forcing it to buckle. The audience barely had time to process what was happening before Voss was behind Garrick, his arms wrapping around the thick neck of his opponent. A single precise movement, a sharp twist, a sickening crack echoed through the arena. The laughter stopped. Garrick's body collapsed into the sand, his massive form twitching once before going still. The crowd did not cheer, they did not roar. They simply stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. The match had lasted mere seconds. Garrick, the undefeated champion, had not even landed a single hit. Voss straightened, his expression unreadable as he glanced up toward the arena masters. Blood trickled down his forearm where one of Garrick's scales had cut him during the struggle, but he paid it no mind. He had barely exerted himself. Silence hung over the Colosseum, thick and unnatural. Then, a voice. "Begin the next match," one of the arena masters barked, breaking the stunned quiet. The second challenger stepped forward, a towering cyborg with glowing crimson optics and a body reinforced with titanium plating, a machine of war. He hesitated only a moment before charging, blades extending from his arms, whirring with deadly speed. The fight began again, and ended just as quickly. A single movement, a perfectly timed evasion, a calculated strike to the exposed wiring at the base of the skull. The cyborg dropped, sparks sputtering from his shattered optics. The arena remained silent. One by one, more challengers stepped forward. One by one, they fell. None of them lasted more than 10 seconds. No injuries, no prolonged struggle, no theatrics, just clean, efficient, brutal executions. The laughter was gone. The jeers had faded. By the time the sixth body hit the sand, the spectators no longer cheered. They watched in horrified silence. Even the most hardened gladiators shifted uneasily. Some clenched their weapons, others stole nervous glances at each other. The human had arrived. And he was not a joke. The corridors beneath the grand arena were dimly lit, their walls lined with ancient metal plating, scarred from centuries of battle. The air carried the scent of sweat, blood, and something deeper, something old and rotting. It was the stench of countless warriors who had passed through these halls, many of whom never left. Charles Voss walked in silence, his boots echoing against the cold floor as he was led toward the gladiator barracks. His escort, a towering Zarl with jagged black scales, said nothing, though his grip on the metal baton tightened with each step. As Voss entered the barracks, the murmur of voices ceased. Dozens of warriors sat along the reinforced benches, their eyes following him with unsettling intensity. The room, built to accommodate creatures of vastly different sizes, featured high ceilings, reinforced walls, and a pit in the center for unarmed combat practice. The lighting was dull, casting long shadows that flickered as flames crackled in steel. At the far end, a group of gladiators sat around a hollow table, their expressions unreadable as they studied him. The largest among them, a four-armed grot covered in dark blue plates, leaned forward. His voice was a low rumble. "You fought well today, human." His massive mandibles clicked together as he spoke, his secondary arms resting on the handles of two sheathed war axes. Too well. Voss didn't respond. He simply met the warrior's gaze and held it. Another gladiator, a Kryn with iridescent chitin and dagger-like appendages folded against his back, hissed. His sharp eyes, like polished obsidian, narrowed. The crowd wanted a show. You gave them execution. A third voice, grating and metallic, joined the conversation. A cyborg, his lower jaw replaced with a mechanical grill, studied Voss with cold, flickering optics. "You were precise. Too precise. That wasn't instinct. That was calculation." Voss remained still, his posture relaxed, but his presence shifted the air in the room. These warriors were testing him, watching, waiting. Finally, a fourth figure emerged from the shadows. Unlike the others, this one moved with a fluid grace, his long limbs wrapped in dark combat leathers. A Yveth, an infamous race of assassins, their agility rivaling even the fastest of war breeds. His silver eyes gleamed as he approached, a smirk playing on his face. "A human who fights like a machine." The Yveth tilted his head. "Now that's something I never expected to see." The room remained tense. The air was thick with something unspoken, something between curiosity and unease. Voss had felt it before. Fear. Not the kind that came from facing an enemy, but the kind that crept in when something didn't make sense. These warriors had seen death. They had been bred for combat, trained to withstand horror. And yet, the way he had fought disturbed them. Voss finally spoke, his voice calm, even. "What do you expect me to do, dance for the crowd?" The grot warrior let out a low, rumbling chuckle. "No, but we expected you to struggle. Silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. Then the barracks doors slid open with a sharp hiss. A figure clad in reinforced armor stepped through. A guard, his stance rigid with authority. He scanned the room before fixing his gaze on Voss. "The arena masters have called for you." A murmur rippled through the gladiators. A summons this soon after a match was rare. Voss nodded once and followed. The halls leading to the master's chamber were even colder than before. The further they walked, the quieter it became, until the distant roar of the Colosseum faded into silence. When the heavy doors finally opened, revealing the chamber beyond, Voss stepped inside. The arena masters sat upon an elevated platform, their forms obscured by the dim light and the thick, curling smoke of exotic incense. Their voices, when they spoke, carried an unnatural weight. "You are an anomaly, human." The central figure leaned forward, his piercing gaze locked on to Voss. "A death worlder with no recorded military rank, no known combat history in the galactic wars, and yet your efficiency rivals the greatest killers in the history of this arena." Another master, his voice rasping through a mechanical filter, spoke next. "Your kind is weak by nature, yet you do not fight like a man trying to prove himself. You fight like a man who has nothing left to prove." Voss remained silent, his expression unreadable. The third master, her voice softer yet no less dangerous, studied him through the haze of smoke. "We must know, Charles Voss. What are you?" Voss met her gaze. For the briefest moment, he considered telling them. He considered describing the war he had survived, the war that had never been recorded in the galactic archives, the war that had not been fought for planets or resources but for survival itself. He considered explaining the kind of battles that had shaped him, not as a warrior, but as something far worse. Instead, he simply said, "A fighter." The masters exchanged glances, unreadable in the dim light. Then the central figure nodded. "You will fight again, tomorrow, and this time we will see just how far your limits go." The doors hissed open behind him. The meeting was over. As Voss stepped back into the corridors, he felt the weight of the gladiators' gazes upon him. He had entered the arena as a curiosity. Now he was something else entirely, something the galaxy was only beginning to understand. The barracks were quieter than before. The usual sounds of sharpening weapons and casual boasting had given way to an unnatural stillness. Warriors sat in clusters, speaking in hushed tones, their gazes flickering toward Charles Voss whenever they thought he wasn't looking. He could feel it. Tension so thick it might as well have been another combatant in the room. He ignored it. The cold metal of the bench pressed against his back as he leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He had been in places like this before. War camps, resistance bunkers, and now gladiator barracks. Locations may change, but the people never did. Fighters could smell a shift in power before it became obvious. He wasn't sure what unsettled them more, the speed at which he killed or the fact that he barely looked like he tried. At the far end of the room, a group of gladiators hovered around a hollow table, their expressions grim. A projection flickered above the metallic surface, casting faint blue light across their faces. Voss had no interest in their conversation until he heard his name. The Yveth assassin, the one with silver eyes and a smirk too knowing for his own good, tilted his head as he studied the projection. "This can't be right," he murmured. "This kill count is impossible." The cyborg with the mechanical jaw, who had been silent for most of the evening, let out a low, distorted chuckle. "And yet, here it is." Voss didn't move, but his mind sharpened. He pushed off the bench and walked toward the group, their voices cutting off as he approached. The holotable's projection displayed a series of numbers, names, locations. He glanced down at the screen. His kill count. The arena's system had tried to compile a history of his battles. It wasn't unusual. Gladiators' records were accessible to those who cared to look. But this was different. The number was absurdly high, over 3,000 confirmed kills. The silence in the barracks deepened. Voss met the Yvette's gaze, waiting. He didn't need to ask the question. The assassin licked his lips, something close to unease flickering in his silver eyes. There's no official record of you in the Galactic War Archives. No mercenary contracts, no planetary skirmishes under your name. He gestured at the data. And yet, you have a kill count that rivals some of the most notorious warlords in the galaxy. The cyborg exhaled through his mechanical grill. Some of the places listed, they're not battlefields. They're extermination zones. A heavy pause followed his words. Voss remained impassive, but inside he traced the locations one by one. Some were familiar, some were wrong. Some had been altered beyond recognition, erased and rewritten by those who controlled history. Someone, somewhere, had tried to dig into his past, and whoever had done it had only uncovered fragments, disjointed pieces of a puzzle they couldn't hope to understand. The Graz warrior who had been silent until now leaned forward. His mandibles clicked, his heavy four-armed frame shifting as he examined the data. "What were you?" His voice rumbled low, cautious. "Not a soldier, not a mercenary." His dark eyes narrowed. "Something else." The room waited for his answer. Voss considered his words. He could tell them the truth, that he hadn't fought in wars as they understood them, that his battles had never been about territory or conquest, that some conflicts never made it into history because no one survived to tell the story. But there was no point. They wouldn't understand. So he simply said, "A survivor." The Yvette let out a quiet breath, studying him like a puzzle missing too many pieces. "Survivors don't leave thousands of bodies behind." Voss didn't reply. He didn't need to. The silence stretched. One by one, the gladiators turned away, but the atmosphere had changed. The laughter and mockery from his first day were gone. In their place, something heavier had settled. Respect and fear. That night, no one challenged him. No one tested him. Even the most hardened killers in the arena avoided his gaze, because now they understood something they had refused to believe before. He wasn't here to fight. He was here because fighting was all he knew. The next fight was different. Charles Voss could feel it before he even stepped onto the sand. The air in the underground corridors leading to the battlefield was heavy with something unspoken. Something that clung to the guards, the handlers, even the other fighters waiting in the dimly lit holding cells. Fear. Not the usual fear of death, of pain, of losing. No, this was something deeper, something instinctive. His footsteps echoed against the metallic floor as he moved toward the arena's entrance, escorted by a silent guard. Normally, the other combatants would have been taunting each other, psyching themselves up for the fight, exchanging threats and boasts. But today, as he passed them, they said nothing. Some looked at him and quickly turned away. Others refused to meet his gaze at all. He had seen it before. The moment when bravado gave way to reality. When warriors realized the stories were true. The massive gates of the arena creaked open, flooding the corridor with harsh, artificial sunlight. The roar of the crowd washed over him, but it was different from the last time. Louder, but not in the same way. Not excited, uneasy. He stepped forward onto the sand. Across from him stood 5 warriors, a team match. A Kryn, his chitinous body glistening under the arena lights, shifted his stance, mandibles clicking nervously. A Zarl, his obsidian scales absorbing the light, rolled his massive shoulders, gripping a warhammer that looked like it weighed more than a full-grown human. A Yvette assassin, clad in dark combat leathers, stood motionless, his silver eyes calculating. A cyborg, his arm-mounted plasma blades humming with restrained energy. And finally, a Graz brute, his 4 thick arms gripping twin battle axes, his breathing slow and heavy. Voss scanned them, reading their postures, their hesitations. They had been chosen carefully, different species, different skill sets. Warriors who had spent years in the arena, killing for survival, for glory, for entertainment. And yet none of them wanted to be here. He saw it in the way the Kryn's leg twitched, in the way the Gratz exhaled too slowly, forcing himself to steady his breath. They had been ordered to fight him, not because they thought they could win, but because the arena masters wanted to know something. How much more could he do? The horn sounded. No one moved. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but it was there, and that was all he needed. Voss exploded forward, his speed unnatural for someone his size. The Kryn reacted first, swinging his dual blades in a rapid, sweeping arc. Voss ducked, the edges slicing through the air where his neck had been, and slammed his fist into the Kryn's abdomen. The exoskeleton cracked. A second blow, a precise strike to the side of the head, and the Kryn collapsed, his body convulsing. The Zarl was next. He roared, bringing the warhammer down with enough force to shatter bone. Voss sidestepped, closing the distance in a blink, and drove his elbow into the Zarl's throat. The scaled warrior choked, stumbling back. Voss caught his wrist, twisted, and drove a knee into his ribs. Something inside snapped. The Yuveth was already moving, faster than the others, knives flashing in the sunlight, a blur of steel aimed at his chest. Voss shifted, let the first strike miss by millimeters, caught the assassin's wrist mid-mation and turned his own momentum against him. A single fluid motion, bones snapped, a scream cut short, and the Yuveth fell, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. The cyborg and the Graz hesitated. A mistake. Voss moved. The cyborg activated his plasma blades, but the human was already too close. A sharp impact to the wrist sent one blade flying. A second strike crushed the cybernetic optics, sending sparks flying. A knee to the stomach, a brutal slam to the back of the head, and the cyborg collapsed. The Graz was alone now. The brute exhaled sharply, gripping his axis tighter, his muscles tensing. He was the strongest of them, the most physically durable, but he wasn't fast enough. Voss didn't wait. He darted forward, weaving through the Graz's wild, desperate swings. A strike to the knee, another to the ribs, then one final precise blow to the throat. The brute crumpled. Silence fell over the arena. The fight had lasted less than a minute. The crowd, usually deafening, was eerily quiet. Thousands of spectators sat motionless, processing what they had just witnessed. The arena masters, watching from their elevated platform, remained still. No applause, no triumphant announcement. This wasn't what they had expected. This wasn't entertainment, it was execution. Voss turned, glancing up toward the masters. He could see the calculation in their eyes, the unspoken conversation passing between them. He had changed something today. This wasn't just another fight. This was fear, spreading beyond the barracks, beyond the gladiators. For the first time, the arena masters realized they had unleashed something they could no longer control. Charles Voss sat alone in the barracks. The silence was suffocating. The other gladiators kept their distance, lingering in the corners of the room, speaking in hushed voices, their gazes shifting toward him when they thought he wasn't looking. He could feel it, the weight of something about to break. The air was different now. It wasn't just fear anymore. Fear alone wouldn't have caused this kind of tension. It was something else, something deeper. The moment always came eventually. He had seen it before. A point where survival became something more than endurance. When men, when warriors, began to ask themselves the one question that had no easy answer. How much longer could they live like this? The doors to the barracks slid open and a group stepped inside. Not guards, not handlers. Gladiators. The ones who had once mocked him. The ones who had watched from the sidelines, waiting to see if he would fall like the rest. Now they stood in front of him. The Graz warrior stepped forward first, his forearms crossed over his chest. His heavy, reptilian face was unreadable, but his dark eyes held something new, something that hadn't been there before. Respect. You fight like something that shouldn't exist, he said, his voice a low rumble. But you fight like a man with no master. Voss didn't answer. He waited. The Yuveth assassin stood beside the Graz, his silver eyes calculating. The arena masters want to know how far you can go. They think you're just another piece on their board. He tilted his head slightly. Are you? Voss exhaled slowly, glancing at the faces around him. Kryn, Zarl, cyborgs, creatures from every corner of the galaxy. Some had fought beside him, others had fought against him. All of them had killed for survival, for spectacle, for the amusement of unseen rulers who had never shed blood themselves. He had known this moment was coming the second the last fight ended. They weren't asking if he wanted to escape, they were asking if he wanted to lead. Voss leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his fingers laced together. The firelight flickered across his face. If you want out, you already know what has to happen. The Grazi's mandibles clicked. The guards won't let us just walk out. The Yvette let out a quiet breath. Then we don't walk. The barracks fell into silence again. No one spoke, but the decision had already been made. Voss rose from his seat, rolling his shoulders. The moment had arrived. It was inevitable. It had always been inevitable. The arena masters had built an empire on the assumption that the strong would always fight for survival, that warriors would always kill when ordered, that blood and fear would always be enough to keep men in chains. Tonight, that assumption would die. The attack began with the first shift change. The guards never expected it. Gladiators fought each other. They didn't unite. They didn't plan. That was how the arena masters had designed the system. Keep them distracted. Keep them desperate. But the masters had made a mistake. They had underestimated what happened when killers stopped fighting for survival and started fighting for something more. The first group moved through the lower corridors, striking fast, cutting down the sentries before alarms could be raised. The Grats ripped through reinforced gates with sheer brute strength. The Yvette slipped between the shadows, severing throats before anyone could even register what was happening. The cyborg hacked the security grid, silencing communications. Voss led from the center, moving with the same precision he had shown in the arena. There was no hesitation, no mercy. The guards, elite as they were, had never fought men like this. Gladiators weren't soldiers. They weren't bound by honor, by rules of engagement. They were killers who had spent every day of their lives learning how to survive against impossible odds. Tonight, they weren't fighting for an audience. They were fighting to end the game. The first explosions tore through the outer gates. Metal groaned and shrieked as reinforced walls buckled under the assault. The once mighty Colosseum, the symbol of the Master's power, was crumbling from the inside. Voss didn't stop moving. Through the chaos, he pushed forward, toward the high chamber where the masters watched, always from a distance, always safe behind their walls of power. Not tonight. The final doors shattered under the force of the Gratz's war axes. Inside, the masters stood frozen. For the first time, Voss saw something new in their expressions. They were afraid. The Yvette smiled. You should have stopped the fights when you had the chance. No one begged. No one spoke, because they all knew. Voss stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the chamber floor. He looked at the rulers who had once held the lives of thousands in their hands. Then, without a word, he ended their rule. The fires burned for hours. By morning, the Colosseum was nothing but ruins. The gladiators who survived did not linger. Some took the ships that had once belonged to the masters and vanished into the stars. Others returned to their homeworlds, warriors no longer bound by chains. Voss watched them go. He did not ask where they would end up. He did not need to. Some would become warlords, others would become legends. He wasn't interested in either. As the last flames died, he stepped onto the ramp of a stolen gunship, the engines humming beneath his feet. He glanced once at the shattered arena, then at the horizon, stretching beyond it. He had fought for survival. Now, for the first time, he was free. And freedom meant only one thing. The fight was finally over.